As we continue in the Acts of the Apostles, the chronicles of the early church as it was getting going, we all of a sudden are beginning to see a little bit of a turn. We've been hearing how everything was going so well with the disciples and people sharing with one another, taking care of one another. And yet now we hear the difficulties of the complaints that some of the people were not being taken care of. And the apostles called together the community and realizes that the Spirit is asking them to allow others to enter into service, that as they have sought to proclaim God's word, that they needed more people to continually care for one another. And so we have the understanding of the beginning of the diaconate, that service of ministry. And we hear of the ones who are called to begin that work. In our lives, we too look at the early church and recognize God's grace truly at work. But what about today? We know that the Spirit continually is active and seeks us to be disciples of Christ. And in understanding the gift of His love for each and every one of us, then how do we respond? And in what ways do we give thanks? Through the sacraments, we look at Jesus seeking to nourish and strengthen us, giving us visible signs of an invisible reality, trying to make sure throughout life that we realize God is working with us. But He also calls us to, in faith, to trust in Him. Imagine being one of the disciples on the boat. All of a sudden it is dark, and I think any of us who have been down by the water, especially at night, of how dark it really can get, and especially if the clouds are overhead because the wind is blowing, that we don't even probably see the stars or the moon. And so all of a sudden it's this darkness, and as they've been rowing for a while, all of a sudden Jesus is walking on the water towards them. And they become frightened. And Jesus says, "It is I. Do not be afraid." And I think that is such a comforting, hopefully, prayer that in times of our doubt, when we are in the darkness, when we can't find the light, that we realize Jesus is there. Don't be afraid. Recognize that faith, that He is with us, and in that faith, that no matter what happens, God's love is real. And in that reality, that we also realize in what ways are we responding to Him. In our relationship with God, in our prayer, that it becomes formal and informal, that we talk to God, that He listens, but then how do we listen to God's response to us? He calls us to serve and recognize the needs of one another and seeking to realize, how do I see Jesus in the other? That I'm not called to be afraid, but in faith to act and serve. As we continue in this Easter season, may we too rejoice. May we be glad and recognize through our baptism that God calls us to continually share His goodness. And in that goodness, especially in the Easter season, that we're not only responding alleluia in joy, but also realizing in the beauty of new life and the blossoming of the trees and the flowers, that God's love is real. And in that reality, how do we, in gratitude, respond in helping each other to rejoice and know of that love?